Welcome to the Organic Filaments Network. Don't forget to like and share and subscribe for more conversations on radical poetics and resistance. This is your host, Sher Ali Khan, and today we're speaking with Nandini Dhar, poet, scholar, and literary insurgent. She is an assistant professor of literary and gender studies at OP Jindal Global University in Sonipat, India, where she researches contemporary gender formations, focusing on conformity, dissent, and affect. Her books, Historians of Redundant Moments, 2016, and Rebought Facsimiles, 2024, Unmake the Archive, challenge the colonial weight of English and refuse historical closure. Through fractured syntax and sharp lyricism, Dar disrupts dominant narratives and insist on history's incompleteness. We'll be talking about the poetry as refusal, the ghosts of unfinished revolutions, and whether radical poetics can still resist co-option. How are you doing, Nandini?
I'm good. Thanks, Cher. How are you?
I'm doing good. Before we dive in, I want to ask, what are you working on next? And are there new projects or books or ideas you're exploring that push your work in new directions?
So, before I go into your question, just a small correction. I used to be based at Sonipat. So, right now I have moved back to Kolkata, which is my hometown.
I,
So, I've moved back to Kolkata and I work for an university in Kolkata. It's called Adamas University, but that's like my professional identity.
I,
I have been working on a new book and I have been trying to process the last 10 years in Bengali history in terms of the politics, what's been going on in terms of the radical politics of the state. Since I also write in Bangla, which is my native language. I've just came out with a book last month, and I have been trying to write a series of poems, very different from the
what,
ones that you have read, which are mostly based on women's history, especially middle class women's history. And I think that this has been one of the things I struggle with, that how does one deal with gender and the poetics, the radical poetics, right? So if you
yeah,
read historians and my earlier work, much of the stuff that I was writing were kind of focusing on domestic spaces, domestic labor, and in some ways there's a deeply classed middle class women's history, and I was speaking directly with the Bengali women poets who write about domesticity, oftentimes kind of throwing back a certain kind of anger at them, not exactly in taking their way of
what,
representation. I was also
mhm.
reading a lot of the anglophone women poets. And since I was living in United States, I was based in United States for 15 years, and we can talk more about it. And I was based in universities. You could not actually stop yourself from coming in contact with the MFA programs, right? So the
Yeah,
kinds of poetry, the kinds of poems, especially around gender, that the MFA poetics um, produced. So I was also in interrogation with them. At the same time, I was also in conversation and reading a lot of the Black women poets. So gender formed a big part of my work. But what I also did not like, that I was getting identified as a domesticity poet or a poet of domesticity. And I think that there are reasons why women oftentimes find it difficult to write that what I call the public lyric, right? Especially if you
mhm.
read the subcontinental poems in Urdu, in Bangla, in Hindi. Public lyric is what occupies that primary space of secular, progressive, liberal poetics, right? And I think that there
Mhm.
are real reasons why actually women find it difficult to write those public lyrics, precisely because their spaces or their kind of location within those publics are not, they cannot be taken for granted. But at the same time, I was trying to get back to that mode of public lyric, and the poems that I'm working on right now, the manuscript, it's tentatively titled Inheritance of an Incompetent Rage. That's kind of an attempt to um, experiment with the public lyric and to move away from the kind of the space of domesticity and kind of the stag as a domesticity poet. So Rebought Facsimiles, which you have read, it's really, I see it as a kind of a much it's a kind of a much smaller in scale. It's really a transition book between historians of redundant moments and the one that I'm working on right now.
In Rebought Facsimiles, you write, to be a self-aware Anglophone poet in India is to be forever engaged in the exercise of listing the spaces where your poems would not be listened to. That's that's a really poignant sort of line I took away from the book. And when we're thinking about language and us as South Asian scholars or people interested in literature and those things and the realm of South Asian English language literature and poetry, uh, on one level, English is a colonial language imposed by violence, and it shapes the very conditions of silence and speech. But do you think breaking with the syntax and form is a way of reshaping the power in language, or how do you view this contradiction of sorts? Uh,
Thank you for that question, Cher. See, that way I see it, that we South Asians, when it comes to languages, we are caught in this catch 22, right? There is no South Asian language which has not acted, or I should say almost no South Asian language which has not acted as an imperialist language to other minor, quote unquote, minor languages. And there is
yeah.
no South Asian language which also hasn't been subject to some form of domination, some form of colonization. So, I mean, it's a very difficult terrain to negotiate, and I don't think a lot of the other languages in this world actually have to keep on negotiating this terrain. And
Mhm.
and I think in the subcontinent, there is this great thrust towards claiming English as an Indian or Pakistani or Bangladeshi or just a subcontinental language, which I would say yes. But at the same time, it's not, I mean, let's not have this illusion about English, right? That it is a subcontinental language in the way Hindi, Telugu, Bangla, Urdu, like the thousands of languages we have in the subcontinent, there are. So in some ways, I think English is different. If it has become a subcontinental language, it has become one through a long continuing colonial and imperial process, the process that kind of continues in one way or the other. It's classed, and
Mhm.
precisely because of that, it also has been claimed by a lot of the minority groups. And I mean, English makes it possible for you and me to interact. I mean, possibly you and I could have still talked to each other, but there are the friends I have with whom without English we cannot really communicate. So I think it's our tragedy and possibility at the same time. So playing with syntax does do that work of um, kind of subverting English to a certain extent. And oftentimes I think we do it without necessarily being aware. So I mean, I did not grow up in a very Anglophone kind of a space, but I did know English. I could write relatively grammatical error free English even before I went to United States. But it was a rude awakening for me when I sat in the American classroom and I was told repeatedly that my English is not good enough. So in a way, what I
Yeah.
was writing without knowing it myself, I was subverting what is American English, what is kind of British English. So in a way, and I try to kind of retain that, but also at the same time, because I've stayed for so long in United States, I have also picked up a lot of Americanisms in my language, so which I think contrasts the earlier generation of the subcontinental uh, Anglophone writers who were picking up Britishisms in their writing. But I think that my generation was also relatively free from trying to impress the British or the American poetry institutions or writing institutions. And there
Hmm.
have been moments like when I tried to deal with the American poetry institution, I literally got a feedback. I still have it on my email somewhere and I can send it to you when I find it out, that post-colonial, I used the word post-colonial, and the feedback was that oh, it must be a very rarefied kind of a word. And I mean, I
Yeah.
actually had to resist myself from shooting back like, no, it is not. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
that you don't really know about it. So I mean, I think that
Yeah.
mm, in a way, having to deal with the American poetry institution taught me a lot of things about myself, about the subcontinent, and about the kind of the global south at large. That what does it mean to actually take the British or the American institutions, literary institutions, writing institutions, on
Hmm.
your own terms, and if you can ever do it. And for me, the answer is no. So I think that there is a certain kind of playing with syntax inbuilt into my English, and oftentimes it's not a deliberate act. It's the way we speak. It's the
Yeah.
way we
Yeah.
communicate with each other.
Hmm. And uh, as a writer, as a poet, uh, how does the question of where your work reaches and who it doesn't reach play into your work?
Yeah.
Because you obviously love what you do, but there's also that sort of feeling of that your work is made for a certain neoliberal or sort of different circuits
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
circulation. Yeah.
I mean, first of all, I don't think my poems reach a whole lot of people. And in a
Yeah.
way, I'm both fine with that and a little bit sad about it, right? Precisely because
Yeah.
it's a double-edged sword. And before we
Which is
go,
what you write.
which is why, right? But before we go into that, um, I think one of the things all independent presses struggle globally is not necessarily production, but distribution. Um,
Hmm.
and it's
It's a
something
huge
that
problem.
it's a huge problem. So you can produce a book, you can also make it to be a really beautiful book. But if you were not reliant on Amazon, and also oftentimes relying on those sources of distribution, it's not at all
Hmm.
cost effective. There are lots of inbuilt economic conditions. So how do you
Hmm.
actually get your book or the work you were doing to your friends whom you do, and you might not even know that you have friends in other parts of the world, in other parts of the country. So distribution is a
Hmm.
huge issue, and oftentimes I think the writers and producers have to take up the work of distribution, which also becomes a complicated sort of an affair, because it looks like you are continuously advertising your work, right? So
Hmm.
and that's also, and then it kind of feeds into the neoliberal machinery. So I think that
Hmm.
distribution has been a huge issue. I have faced that challenge quite a bit. And given that
Hmm.
literature festivals in the subcontinent and especially in India right now are tied to the big corporations, and I refuse to kind of be put up as, I mean, I have been to some of these festivals during the early days of my like writing life.
Hmm.
I don't think
Yeah.
much happens creatively. I have been there just to keep an open mind. So, as a writer, as an artist, I would say that not much happens creatively anyway. So, it's not even that you can get a lot out of these processes as a creative person, as a critical person, in terms of your craft. These are spectacles which are meant to be spectacles. But on the other hand, I think that there are uh, right now the festival scenario, the literary festivals, and there have been critics about it, um, and some very vocal critiques about it are deeply tied to the corporations and what I would call the corporation sponsored genocides in the subcontinent, right? And I
Yeah.
refuse to be the face of that, even if it means that my poems are being read only by 5 people. And can we actually, I mean, I guess the question that I often face, that can we actually avoid coming in touch with the corporations in our lives? No. Can
Hmm.
we oftentimes afford to not work for the corporations? No. So I have no problem in saying that I have been a worker for the corporate university for as long as I have been doing this work. I'm a privileged worker, but I also go into the spaces as a worker, which is very, very different from going up on stage and giving them the space to actually use your face as a writer, as an artist. So even if though it's completely impossible for me or for you or for us to avoid the corporations or the existence of the corporations in our lives, I think it is possible to reduce the amount of complicity we actually show in terms of our engagement with them. And the reduced complicity is an important aspect of our existence if we have to retain our sense of criticality. Not that we
Yeah.
always do that as middle class writers, artists, academics, critics, whatever name you give to ourselves. But it is an important way of life. I believe so. So that puts a lot of pressure on us to build up other networks, other kinds of radical friendships, radical solidarities, which I think we are doing by doing this kinds of
Yeah.
shows,
Yeah.
by speaking to each other. Uh, but at the same time, I would be the first one to say that I don't think that my work reaches too many people. There is a power in that. And I don't know if I go up on a festival stage that's been sponsored by any of the corporate um, houses. Would that actually get me more audience, the kind of audience I want? I don't think so. It would possibly get me into the drawing rooms of more, like, the powerful and the wealthy, but I don't see it as an access. I do think that there are other kinds of festivals, weak as they are, like the kind of the people's literary festivals, which are being organized throughout the subcontinent on a much smaller scale. And whenever we can, showing up for those spaces or even building up those spaces, organizing those spaces ourselves can be a powerful mode of actually getting our work across to each other. So I believe in this power of having my work reach to one more person who sort of understands it, and then that person actually gets it out to 5 of their friends. The way things
Yeah.
work and the way things have historically worked for us. And I think that, again, given that what we have seen in the last few years, the clamping down on the digital spaces, I think that even
Yeah.
as we keep on using the digital space, there is no actually substitution for the real life friendships, even when they are mediated by the digital spaces, and getting ourselves to do the hard work of kind of this
Yeah.
clandestine and underground passing of our work to each other.
Yeah. We have to become more fugitive in our
Correct.
practices.
Right. Absolutely.
So, yeah. So I want to get into your book, History of Redundant Moments, which immediately sets the tone with the title Redundancy, Failure, Repetition. There's, uh, I should rephrase it. You write that a failed insurrection and its broken archives, the past, present, and future half loves, half convictions, the shame and embarrassments of half beliefs. There's something sharp about the phrasing half loves, half convictions, half beliefs. What drew you to this idea of redundant moment? Uh, in a broader sense, because we have seen Sadia Hartman talk about uh, the archive as filled with silences and those things, and you're coming at this with with the redundant moment, and I really appreciated that.
Yeah, yeah. So yes, I mean there are a lot of things that were inbuilt into this kind of idea of redundant moments. One of the things is, if you read this book, it's I mean it's an effort to see the world through children's eyes, right? And especially these two little
Mm,
girls who happen to be twins. So, in some ways, we think of children's lives as unimportant, as essential but redundant, right? Little girls,
hmm
even more so, especially in the subcontinent. No one thinks about little girls as political agents, as political subjects. So, there is that kind of harping back, a certain kind of irony built into that. But there is also something about, I mean, I kind of academically came of age during that moment of everyday modes of resistance. So James Scott. Um, and I mean, whereas I do love a lot of the things that James Scott was doing, I am extremely uncomfortable in the way James Scott's work was appropriated by the American academic institutions and American
hmm
formal uh, anthropology, formal social sciences. And it almost became a way of advocating de-radicalization, demobilization. So as long as the employees bitch about their employer over a cup of coffee or a drink, they're
yeah,
resisting, right? So let's not
yeah,
form unions. Let's not ever go to the picket lines. Let's just bitch over coffee about our boss,
yeah,
and that's somehow resistance. And I'm not saying that is not resistance, but how that easy understanding of resistance actually caused huge amounts of injury to the American Union movement, to American academia. I think that you are living through that moment. I mean, we all are living through that moment. So what I was thinking that, wait a minute. So social movements do have their everyday, right? There are
hmm
extremely unspectacular moments inbuilt into the social movements. So social
yeah,
movements, even of the most violent kind, are never really about the spectacle. They're never really about that. The spectacle might be a moment. No one actually talks about the everyday unspectacular work that goes on behind every political spectacle, say a rally, a coming together of some kind of performative protest. And
hmm
so this idea of every day seemed very problematic to me, while at the time being extremely essential. So I was also trying to point out to these redundant moments in our political lives, which would never really go into the political histories, into our official histories of radicalisms. And radical movements do have their official histories, right? So the
yeah,
and much of that work actually happens inside homes, inside the domestic spaces. And I'm not advocating that. I'm not saying that women should actually be relegated to the domestic space, cooking food for the revolutionaries and offering them kind of that emotional material sustenance. But that's how it
mm,
has historically happened. And those are the redundant moments. So what are the kind of the discontents of those redundant moments? So, what are the
mm,
processes through which these two little girls, and who are very different from each other, who actually begin to witness those processes and who actually begin to think through these processes in very different ways?
yeah, absolutely. And do you see a part of your poetry as sort of looking to recover what has been lost uh, or exposing what was never whole to begin with? You know, in
Yes.
terms of uh, in terms of these lives,
Mm.
especially in the gendered context, like women in that sense, like they're missing from a lot of narratives around. Yeah.
Right. Yes. I mean, absolutely. And I think that the women writers have done an incredible amount of work globally, but especially the subcontinent, in Urdu, in Bangla, in English too, in actually retrieving those histories, right? So, and
Hmm.
I'm sure that when we sit together with a cup of chai, we can keep on reciting these great lines and poems by both Urdu and Bengali women writers who have done this enormous amount of heavy lifting. But
Hmm.
I think, as far as poetry is concerned, especially South Asian poetry, the lives of the little girls remain relatively unexplored. So childhood is talked about in two ways. One in a very nostalgic kind of a way, and it makes sense. I mean, childhood is possibly the only time when most women feel a little bit at home inside their bodies and at home
Yeah.
with the home at large, right? So
Yeah.
that space becomes that space of romanticism, that space becomes the space of nostalgia. The one moment that is written about a lot is that period of menstruation, so that sexual coming of age, but not necessarily with the sexual act, but with the realities of the female body. So if you see
Yeah.
that I have refused to write about sexuality or the sexual coming of age in this book, there is no reference to this girl's um, getting their menstruation, and it's kind of set in this time when they're really little. But that's the period, I think, that is oftentimes lost from women's poetry. And I also didn't necessarily want to write about childhood or girlhood in this romantic kind of a way, but I wanted to write about the violences of girlhood and violences that the family thrusts upon the little girls, the violences that they do to each other, and just the kind of the violence of the world, but also the fun, right? The playfulness of that
Yeah.
time in girls' lives. So sneaking out of
Yeah.
home, um, coming across, and I think a lot of these things are lost, right? So I was literally writing about the pre-liberalization era, the street fairs, where you do
Yeah.
get to see these weird things, which I would describe as South Asia's own forms of surrealism. So a lot of the things I have written about are not necessarily
Interesting.
surrealist at all. They're very real, but they're South Asia's realisms.
Yeah. No, that's really well put. So just to keep the conversation moving, I'm gonna jump back to Rebought Facsimiles,
Yeah,
and you
yeah,
write the city is an exercise in incongruence,
right.
unmaking of the photocopy of what came before. That line seems to read to me as like a manifesto in the sense that does poetry intervene in the archive in your mind, or does it just expose its failure? In a way.
I mean, it's both, right? So if you think
Um.
of that Brecht's great word, that manifesto is coarse writing. In lots of
Mhm.
ways, I think my writing is very coarse, and I'm
Mhm.
perfectly fine with that. I don't want that porcelain feeling of much of MFA poetics, right? So,
Yeah.
um, and I think that, it's funny, when I first came across the MFA workshops, one of the things that would be repeatedly asked to me, that where is the conflict in your poems? And I found it
Mhm.
to be fascinating because I have always seen United States, the American society, to be a society where it's not that there aren't any conflicts, but where all the conflicts are resolved very, very quickly in and through capital, right? So, and the conflicts keep on circulating, and they kind of keep moving through the
Mhm.
circles, uh, and ultimately um, completely dissolve into this extremely status quo solutions. So, to think of conflict as the central element of American poetics, it didn't make sense to me. But then what I
Yeah.
recognized, that what is conflict according to MFA poetics are really these very small interpersonal conflicts. And I'm not saying
Mhm.
that those are not important, and I'm not saying that those do not necessarily impact the larger conflicts, or they're not necessarily symptoms of larger conflicts. They are, but at the same time, how does actually one move to this space where clearly as an individual I'm there but I'm not important. So I think that the lines that you quoted were really like that, right? That I'm there, I'm making my
Hmm.
observations, but whatever happens to this city, it's part of a long, long process. So, and if
Hmm.
you think about it, that South Asian cities are these extremely interesting but also annoying, um, and irritating, mind boggling archives themselves, where numerous centuries kind of coexist with each other, numerous architectural styles coexist with each other. So, and after a while, they all become part of these kind of, our sense of surrealism, which I don't think you can analyze, but you can sort of make note of. So, in some ways,
Hmm.
if you ever come to Kolkata, you would see this like the stately buildings. Some parts of it are so European. And there is
Hmm.
literally parts of the city which were built as quote unquote white towns, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
when we now walk through the cities, you might actually feel, I mean, other than the poverty, which never lets you actually forget that you are in the subcontinent, that these are parts of Paris or London. So,
Yeah.
how these urban plannings of elsewhere were brought into the subcontinent and they became completely different things. But then you can
Hmm.
also argue that parts of Paris or London are extremely messy and full of poverty too. So,
Yeah.
but in some ways, that's what I was trying to record, that I'm here. But I, as an individual, I don't really matter, right? But I'm part of a larger historical process where my own personal conflicts, my own interpersonal conflicts are really inconsequential.
Yeah. No, that's a very interesting answer. So I want to get into your poetry doesn't just challenge historical narratives, it's also disrupting the way we're seeing language on the page, right? And you talked about that a little bit earlier. And what I found striking in both books was the way you say, for example, you say, "This I am is an indigo's planter's whip on my tongue, a schoolmaster's baton on my bare skin, a textbook meter." Right? It seems like linguistic refusal to me of sorts,
Yeah,
and that you and and I was wondering, what was your sort of process of writing that? What were you trying to get at? Uh, we see that throughout both books, where you
right.
you play around with the linguistic form in a way where it's almost like you're refusing to be complicit.
I think that part of it is just straight up Bengal's history, right? So the history of
Yeah.
the indigo plantations as well as the indigo rebellion in 19th century. And so coming back to that, but I'm also very, very aware that the indigo rebellion was a peasant movement. So I cannot necessarily reclaim that movement as my own, in an unproblematic kind of a way, but it's
Hmm.
there. It's there as part of my, and I think that, and oftentimes when you speak about South Asian local histories, it becomes very
Hmm.
difficult to explain them in terms of the Anglophone, especially American categories, right? Academic categories.
Yeah.
So there is,
Absolutely.
so there is that. So how do you actually get into this dense linguistic archives of the subcontinent, both political and literary, and maybe also the legal archives, and explain them to an American audience, academic audience, through the academic terminology? I find it to be almost impossible, but also, um, I don't come from a family background or a communal background where English is the language. There are other South Asian writers who do. Um, so for me, English has always been a foreign language. English has, I mean, I cannot just walk into a space in my community and speak in English or read out my poems in English. And kind of take it for granted that I would be understood. At best, everyone would be like, "Whoa, she writes in English," right? Like
Yeah.
sense of um, awe. Oh, she has
Yeah.
writings, kind of like that.
Yeah.
Um, so in some ways, it's also kind of just admitting that on page, but I think that admitting that on page also has a certain kind of resonance for me. There are lots of South Asian English poets who are most comfortable in English. And if you read my poems, you would probably find that other than one or two places, I don't use Bangla words or Bangla script, partly because I don't feel that need to. I write in Bangla, right? So, in a way that I do have that other space of linguistic exploration uh, open. So, in some ways,
Yeah.
I don't see that need to kind of live my Bangla self, or that kind of my poetic, like the writer self in English on page, and try to play with hybridity. I mean, of course, we are all hybrid, but that deliberate hybridity, which has become the signpost of much of the subcontinental poetry and even prose, I don't feel the pressure to do that. I'm like, if you want to know what I'm writing in Bangla, make an effort to learn the language and read my poems in Bangla or translate them straight up. I do self translate sometimes because there is only so much you can do as a single human being. But also, a lot of my poems in Bangla are very different. Um, but I think that I was at
How are they different? Would you say?
I one of the things is that I'm engaging more with the Bangla Literary Archive. I use the everyday Bangla a lot more. I play with the everyday Bangla a lot more, so a lot of it is linguistic and literary. Um, and
Hmm.
also, maybe I'm trying to use both the women's language as well as a more masculine public political language.
Okay, interesting. Uh, so, would you say that can radical poetics exist within traditional forms, or do we have to always break from them?
I mean, I think it's both, right? I mean, what is tradition? And can we go back to the tradition? And of course we do. So if you think about it right now, in both India and Pakistan, there is this kind of resurgence of IPTA poetics, right? The progressive poetics.
Yeah.
So, and which wasn't exactly the case when I was growing up. I mean, of course, there were always people who were going back to these poems, the songs, the short stories. But at the same time, I think that we are feeling this need to revisit that archive, to bring alive those poems and songs in a way like Manto. So, seems so much more relevant right now on all sides of the border, right? So,
Yeah.
and in a way that uh, he didn't in the 80s, possibly because
Hmm.
our societies were moving through different moments. I'm not saying that he wasn't being read or there weren't people who were engaging with him. So I mean, Faiz, as problematic he is, I see a resurgence in kind of reciting Faiz poems, are a lot of the radical ghazals, and the same thing with a lot of the Bangla IPT or progressive traditions. So I think we do go back to the traditional uh, poetics, we do go back to the traditional cultural productions again and again. And of course, the flip side of that argument is that can we then just say that finally the progressive poetics in the subcontinent, it has lost all of its radicality, right? That finally it has become that kind of archival artifact. And when you are
Yeah.
in academia, when you see a lot of um, I don't know how to sugarcoat this word, reactionary assholes working on progressive writers who had
Yeah.
never have had anything to do with any progressive social movements, but for them, it's a sheer work of intellectual, cultural, like CV making,
Yeah.
cultural capital. You do feel that, right? That who
Yeah.
gets to represent Manto and Faiz and Sholil Chaudhuri and Ritik Ghatuk in academia, but at the same time, that the working with these texts with these kinds of tradition, it's never
Hmm.
unilinear. There is something about it that's passed on. There is also this necessity to keep on critiquing. um, I don't read Manto in the same way that possibly his contemporaries were doing, right? But I also
Yeah.
don't read him as a critique. I read him as someone who is very present in the work of producing cultural productions. And as much, I mean, I don't claim to be an activist precisely because I think that the work of an activist needs so much more, and I cannot possibly do that. But that activist essence which I have in my work, in my theoretical work, so for me, going back to these figures, to their work, is it's never simply as a critique. It's almost always about trying to get what I can while also breaking the form. So I think if you actually read, especially historians, I was very, I don't know to what extent it shows, only my readers can say that. I was very aware of what has been excluded in the subcontinental progressive poetics, which is precisely the lives of women, the deep lives of women, right? And
Yeah.
I was trying
Absolutely.
to insert that back, the history of the
Hmm.
domestic spaces. Um, and I mean, I think that in some ways you can name writers like Chuktai in Bengal, Shulekha Shannal, uh, but they were prose writers, they were fiction writers predominantly. So, what is it about the progressive poetics, which was mostly masculine and almost completely excluded women's lives? Other than those moments when there are these kind of radical allegories, right? So I
Yeah.
was fascinated.
Absolutely.
So I do think that
So
it's a complicated relationship. I keep going back to the tradition, but also I try to play with the tradition. I try to break open the traditions.
how do you view, because part of this resurgence has to do with social media, right? And the circulation of snippets of poetry in an oral form, right? Rather
Um,
than
yeah, in my
because
case,
that is one of the reasons why, you know, it has become, you've seen a resurgence of a lot of these figures.
yes,
I see it all the time on social media, like people sharing like quotes from Fez or
media has definitely played a huge role, but social
yeah,
media also has trivialized the tradition, right? So you can quote couple of lines from Fez, or you can share a song and never actually and transform those fragments into this fetish without
yeah,
necessarily engaging with the larger tradition. But
yeah,
definitely it has created a larger space of sharing and interest, undeniably. Uh, but I think also social media is
yeah,
a kind of an echo chamber, right? So
yeah,
if you want to, you can be part of the right wing social media. If you want to, you can be part of that left liberal social media. And I'm not saying that the
yeah,
two don't intersect, but it has its own aesthetics, it has its own sociology. So in some ways it's really complicated, but undeniably social media has played a huge role in it. And whereas I'm not hyper present on social media, but I do think that I'm not against using social media or really any technology
oh,
to begin
of
with.
of course. So I want to get back into the domestic as a battlefield, right?
Yeah.
Uh, uh, in Rebought Facsimiles, you write the severed tongues buried inside the rice pots. It's you use this haunting image, uh, the domestic space isn't just a backdrop here; it is a site of erasure, of silencing. Why do you return to these intimate spaces when writing about sort of historical forms of violence?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is kind of again going back that, and thanks for actually picking that imagery up, picking those lines up. So, there is a really long tradition in Bengali progressive poetics, people's poetry, to represent women as cooking rice, right? So, rice is a big metaphor. It's an extremely important image for much of Bengali progressive poetics, and it makes sense given the history of the famine, especially in like the 1943 famine, the post 1943 poetry. But what is also lost, and also women, when they're talked about inside the radical movements, are oftentimes as mothers and sisters who are waiting with this pot of rice, waiting for the sons, and not always necessarily biological sons, but kind of the sons and brothers to come up, to come back and eat, right? And I was trying to kind of go back to the tradition, that what is being lost precisely are the political voices of these women, both their labor and their political voices and their creative voices. So it's a commentary on women's lives, but it's also a commentary on the masculine progressive poetics, where women are always reduced to this essential image of cooking rice for the revolutionaries.
Absolutely. So, uh, would you view the home as a parallel to like sort of the nation state in a sense where power dictates who speaks, who is erased?
Yeah, I mean, of course. And I think, I mean, I kind of don't want to make that comparison because there are obvious dangers to that kind of an allegorization of home. But it's a material space. It's an extremely powered space. It's a gendered space. It's a classed space. And I think in the context of the subcontinent, it's also a very castized space, right? So the women are the ones who are preserving the caste norms of touchability, of culinary purity, what kind
Hmm.
of food should be eaten when, what kind of food is pure and should be kept or should not be kept in contact with actual bodies or other food items. So in some ways, domestic women's domestic labor uh, retains the status quo, retains the conservative nature of the subcontinental homes.
How do you how do you see domestic spaces in terms of the city in your poetry?
Um, I mean, so women are asked to spend their lives in the homes, right? So for a
Yeah,
lot of women, and I do write about that more in the volume I'm working on. So for a lot of the women, the city kind of comes through the windows or the terraces or the short walks they take uh, when
yeah,
they are out to you know, to go shopping, to run errands. But it's never really the city in its entirety, right? So you
yeah.
rarely see women, say after nine or so, in any of the major cities in the subcontinent, a group of women or even a mixed group who are hanging out in the street, um, engaged in some kind of addebazi, right? So in
Hmm.
the tea shops, the universities are a little bit different because the universities are like homes. They're problematic institutions, but at the same time, for 3 to 5 years of their lives, women might experience some amount of relative openness. They can experience, for example, sitting in a tea shop with their male friends, with male classmates, chit chatting. But other than that, tea shops are close to women. And I think it's also something you grow up with as a middle class woman. You also, it's not like people would actually kick you out. It's not like you would get ripped immediately when you sit down for a cup of tea in the kind of in a tea shop. But it's a sensor that's inbuilt in your mind that that's not my space. So the city is not my space. I cannot access every bits and parts of the city. So in some ways, home, or those kind of, that fragmented view of the city is what
Yeah.
a woman's city is. And it's extremely
Hmm.
difficult to write about, precisely because the city kind of demands to be experienced in its entirety. But then also you can possibly say the same thing about class, right? That especially in cities are always unequal. So what are the spaces which are completely closed to working class men? And I think in the post liberalization era, more and more South Asian cities are closing themselves off to poor working class populations of any gender. So, who are the increasing
Yeah.
number of coffee shops for? Um, so, in all sorts of a lot of middle class women, they do find a certain kind of idea of safe space in the kind of this new style coffee shops, right? But at the same time, are these coffee shops equally open to the working class women, to the lower middle class women? Obviously not. To what extent
Hmm.
these cafes are open to the workers without any
Yeah.
union rights, working for wages which are literally below living wage, below poverty line, um, who are working in these cafes. So, in some ways, the
Yeah.
cities are always fragmented spaces, and they are becoming even more so in the subcontinent.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And it's glaring, right?
And
I mean, I think that compared to an American city, you don't see, I mean, of course, American cities are deeply unequal too, but you don't feel that inequality until and unless you are really looking for it. But in South Asia, I mean, in South Asia, everything, I mean, you cannot actually, if you're a middle class person in South Asia, uh, you would be faced with your own complicity every single day, even if you are just trying to live, you are struggling in your own life, right? So I mean, it's almost always in fragments.
yeah. So I want to discuss on the future of radical poetics. Uh, you write, poetry does nothing. Poetry changes nothing. Yet a world where no poems are being written is inherently unlivable. That is like a tension a lot of poets wrestle with. Does poetry intervene, or is its power in its refusal to intervene? Where do you land on this?
Yeah, I mean, I will try not to be too pessimistic, right? So
Yeah.
my natural inclination is to say that there is no, I don't see any possibility of any real radical poetics emerging in the subcontinent anytime soon. Um, precisely because radical poetics and radical art depends upon radical movements and the
Yeah.
fate of the radical movements in South Asia. As you know, it's not very hope inducing, right? Um, Rather, we are seeing the
Yeah.
death of uh, certain kinds of radicalisms, the 20th century radicalisms, and no other positive radicalisms are being born. The radicalisms that are
Yeah.
being born are really right wing radicalisms.
Yeah.
So, but at the same time, I also would,
And the left wing radicalisms are.
yeah, I mean, I will try not to act during this session, not to go into my usual pessimistic rants about the leftists in South Asia. Let's reserve that for an off camera where we are not being
Yeah. Yeah.
recorded. But at the same time, I think that we actually have a lot of work to do in the subcontinent in order to build up viable left radical movements or even left democratic movements, right? Um, So, and I don't see that happening. But at the same time, I want to retain my sense of hope that something would happen uh, out of all the confusion. Something would happen, and we are trying to do certain things, and these conversations matter. So in the same way, I think in terms of the radical poetics, I would not say that nothing is being done. There are things that are being written, there are things that are being done, but I do think that the neoliberal appropriation of radical poetics, of radical art, it's a threat. And it's a threat that didn't quite exist for the 20th century radical artists in the same way. So we actually have to think about the market and the market's power to appropriate all kinds of radical thought, and through that appropriation, de radicalize the content. And in a way, I think a lot of the fascisms, uh, did kind of in the they work in weird ways, right? So it
Mhm.
becomes almost impossible for the market to actually retain the neoliberal appropriation while they're also keen on working with the fascist governments, while they're also trying to work with the religious right wing. And we are seeing that throughout the subcontinent, in whatever forms the religious fundamentalisms come in our respective societies. And at the end of the day, what we're also seeing that religious fundamentalisms, irrespective of whatever religion they're holding on to, they speak in like surprisingly similar languages, right? The kind of the
Yeah,
details
absolutely.
might differ from each other, but it's almost like they are having clandestine conversations amongst each other, within their own organizations, in the way you and I are talking to each other. So I think that in some ways, I also want to retain the hope that something would emerge, but I do think we need to be really, really con- uh, aware and cautious about the market's ability to appropriate radical poetics. And also, I would say that, who am I to kind of claim that high ground? In another 5 years, you might see me being appropriated by the market. So it's not necessarily about the individual, but it's about the process. But we need to keep talking about this process.
Yeah. No, this has been an incredible conversation. Your poetry, obviously, it unsettles history, disrupts language, and refuses containment. And it reminds us that history isn't just about what's recorded, but it's also about what's erased. And I think, like, especially what you mentioned there, we have to keep hope. And again, thank you for being on the show. And
Thanks for inviting me, Share. Yeah.
yeah, this has been amazing. And thank you for sharing your insights. And to everyone watching, don't forget to share, and subscribe for more conversations like this. Thank you.
Thanks.